Greetings and good day, y'all, from Chengdu, China. So, my name again is Kevin Mann, and I teach at Sichuan University, teaching propaganda and intercultural communication. When we look at intercultural communication, we use the book from Don Snow, and of course, it focuses on how we're different. It basically talks about how cultures and peoples from different cultures are distinct from one another. Of course, as my father said growing up, accentuate the positive, Kevin, accentuate the positive. So to accentuate the positive, I do stress how we're more similar than we are dissimilar. For the sake of science, we will actually look at, say, how we are not alike, how we're different, how we're distinct from one another. We will categorize, say, like mammals and reptilians or reptiles and amphibians and birds and so forth. We do separate, say, animals into different categories. So it is, for the sake of science, it is beneficial to actually maybe segregate and separate these types and kinds of organisms apart from one another. I grant you that. However, as I said, my father would basically, like I said, recommend, accentuating the positive. And I think basically focusing on how we're different is actually focusing on the negative. So by focusing on the positive, I actually do show my students that we are much more similar than we are dissimilar. I've worked in dozens of different countries around the world, and quite honestly, I can see how we're, vastly more similar than we are dissimilar. So the concept of being so different to me is actually a misnomer, and I would say that through the course of the semester, I can actually show people that we are almost, I can't say synonymous or the same, but we are very, very, very similar on almost all aspects. Because most people, they just want to be left alone to their own devices. They just want to basically secure for their families, their financial security or maybe their physical security. And, like I said, being left to those devices so they can, of course, provide for those family members and, those material goods and those safety nets and those what we would do or how we would regulate or maybe measure a standard of living. So these things are all afforded to us and through our hard work and our diligence and prudence and so forth. But we basically are, like I said, just more similar than we are dissimilar. Having said that, I want you to understand that I do. I'm giving you an introduction today to let you see what I'm actually going to do, or what I do in my classroom. Starting out, we basically do look at differences between, say, I of course gave them the anecdote about Bill Alexander, about how the 5 techniques that we learn, so comparing and contrasting, so forth like this. However, I'm going at a sequence with you and my students because my students, we actually do a comparison between, say, science and pseudoscience. That one I'm going to defer to maybe the next video, but that's because I did want to get to racism today because I did promise you we would talk about it. So what do I do, like by the 3rd or 4th class? We'd basically do a presentation on utopia. So what are your ideals? So identifying those ideals, how can you compare your ideals to, say, another person's ideals? By looking at yourself, you better understand of how alike or different the other person is. And so once you look at it, really look at it, then of course you can ascertain that, we are much more similar than we thought. You'll see that these words tend to be called upon readily by everyone, and so you'll see that everyone has a common vocabulary when it comes to utopia. So having said that, just know that I gave them three sources to start with. Of course, we're in China, so I gave them Confucius, Mencius, two philosophers who talked about utopia in their utopian writings. Talk about like what is the ideal society, what is the maybe perfect society, and of course the third source was Tao Yunming, and Tao Yunming, of course, is a Chinese poet, and he from like the maybe, I'm gonna say maybe 5th century, 6th century, but I'm not. I honestly can't remember how old he really is. But several centuries ago, he wrote an article. I mean, a poem for basically the peach blossom spring, and it's a beautiful poem. It basically talks about a utopian village that he finds hidden, and so it's like a gem. And so anyway, it's a more rural, more country or rustic setting, but it is what many academians or academics would basically identify as a utopian ideal or a utopian story. So I wanted you to know this because I want you to see just how and where they went, and then of course we're going to compare, say, their utopia, the Chinese utopia or the Asian utopia, with that of our utopia. But of course, these utopians, if you notice that Plato, Sir Thomas More, and Gene Roddenberry, and Karl Marx, these four writers, they basically have one thing in common. They all did away with private property to some extent, right? So like, for example, Plato, of course, basically said all public servants, in other words, if you're a senator, you did not own any private property. In other words, all your property was, of course, given to you by the state. So, of course, this could be one means of trying to regulate corruption, right? In other words, if, say, your estate, your house, your land, everything is given to you by the state, then of course you wind up, maybe parked in your driveway as a sailboat, and people are like, well, Kevin, where'd you get the sailboat? And so then they would know that, of course, someone else had to give it to you because that was not given to you by the state. And of course, there are ways around Plato's utopian ideal of, basically depriving, say, public servants of property. I mean, there's always, buy you dinner or prostitution. So there are ways around these different, techniques and different things that our utopians wrote about in the Western context. But I don't know if you've ever read Confucius, but of course Confucius emphasized personal and government morality, harmonious and social relationships, righteousness, kindness, sincerity. In other words, he says, with a just leadership, you will have basically a just society. And it kind of makes sense, right? But another writer who followed him just within a century or two was Mencius. And of course, Mencius, he basically was writing that if you have a moral leader, in other words, the righteous state will flourish naturally. I mean, almost, naturally. In other words, I think we actually have a very similar way of thinking about this too, is because you hear people say, live by the sword, die by the sword. Violence begets violence. Morality begets morality. Justice begets justice. So this idea that, that morality can lead to more morality, it's not just a Chinese concept. We have the same concept in even the Christian, the Christian mythos, or Christian folklore or Christian history. We basically have these same ideas that, think of it this way. In, say, what's the flip side of that? If the leadership is corrupt, corruption begets corruption. In other words, what if, say, you decide to evaluate or judge or weigh success based on money. So if money is the metric for success in your society, and you basically are like, okay, so this is how we're going to do things. We're going to basically measure things based on this materialism, on how many toys a person can acquire in their lifetime. Then, of course, you can see that, well, people are going to learn the game. People are going to say, well, if that's the way you basically measure success, by God, I'm going to do it this way. And so your corruption begets more corruption. It's the same philosophy or same idea that, well, why do people lie? People lie because they are, trying to cover up other wrongs, other misdeeds. And so by lying, they basically are trying to hide their other misdeeds. And so that corruption begets corruption, that iniquity contributes or begets iniquity. So it's that same idea, right? Because we're basically saying that if you have a moral leadership, maybe according to Confucius and Mencius, that it will lead to moral behavior of the people, because if they don't have to learn the game, as we might say, like racketeering or profiteering and like war profiteering or black marketing and all these other things, then they won't have to compete on that level. They basically just presume or assume that everyone else is honest. And that's, of course, that's one reason we find ourselves in this cesspool today, is because we have a leadership that is as corrupt as they come, but yet they hide it very well. And they are very, very good, well, very successful liars, I would just say it that way. But so Confucius, Mencius, and Tao Yuanming are three of the writers in the Chinese literature that basically write about their utopia here in the East. And so I usually tell my students, but based on, I'll give you these three sources. You don't have to use these three sources. You can use others. And they usually, you'll see in a moment, they actually use all kinds of sources. But I asked them to give me presentations as a group on Utopia. Before we get started, though, well, I do a quote of the day. So who do you think said, "A foolish faith in authority is the worst enemy of truth"? A foolish faith in authority is the worst enemy of truth. Actually, what he said was, "Er Tatstursel ist der größte Feind der Wahrheit." And of course, in other words, he's German. What was it? Immanuel Kant, Charles Dickens, Friedrich Nietzsche, Albert Einstein, Charlie Chaplin. And of course, it was Albert Einstein, July 8, 1901. He was talking to his university professor. His university professor was a classical physicist, and so he would not entertain basically some of Albert Einstein's thought experiments, because Albert Einstein wanted his opinion on a thought experiment. And so, basically the professor, my understanding is, was like, grow up, stop with your childish games. And so, this is physics, and he was a classical physicist. He adhered to the model given to us by Sir Isaac Newton. But anyway, I digress. So Albert Einstein basically was saying that, a blind faith or a foolish faith in authority is the worst enemy of truth. And so who was made to look like the fool? The professor or Albert Einstein, right? Well, the utopia that they report on, like I said, I gave them the three sources, Confucius, Mencius, and Tao Yuanming. But as you can see, these are the actual results of a one semester. And they talk about utopians, they talk about utopian socialists, they talk about dystopians, they have model nations where they're trying to compare, say, their utopia to another nation that actually, exist. Um, they mention things like Zootopia, the movie, and other things like this. And of course, they go into related topics like Taoism, the Gini coefficient or the Gini index, Lao Tzu, which is another great philosopher here in China, who, as you probably know, probably created Taoism, or founded it, and wrote about. I think he has many books on the subject about his charts. And anyway, you'd have to read it for yourself. If you don't know Lao Tzu, then I digress. I tried to break down all the different words that they use, because this is a language or communication course. So I didn't want to give them a bunch of bar charts and flow charts and things like this. So I or pie charts and things like this. I didn't want to overburden them with too many details, so I just broke it down into one slide. The things in black, at least 3 out of 4, I know it's anecdotal, but 3 out of 4 people said this. Of course, if you compare this to, say, people in the West, and it's almost synonymous. I mean, I've worked in dozens of different countries, and I can honestly tell you, the people I talk to from Africa, Europe, North America, Asia, I've been around the world, and so the Middle East. So I can tell you that this is pretty synonymous. In other words, it's not the same, but it is very similar across the board with what they talk about. The things they talk about: abundance and diversity and harmony and integrity and prosperity and of course morality. But these are the type things that they say are ideal to them. These are the things they pursue. These are the things they wish for. These are their goals or ambitions, to see a world where maybe you see more holism, like holistic. Of course, you don't notice that only a handful of people use the word holistic or even UBI. I think this semester only had like maybe two students say UBI or universal basic income, or maybe 3 or 4 at most. But this is the outcome of those speeches, of those presentations. So just to clarify, though, I will go into a little more detail. In 1910, the leading cause of death was pneumonia and influenza. So these young kids today, they seem to think that COVID was a rarity. In other words, that somehow COVID-19 was an exception. But pneumonia and influenza has always been a deadly virus. Every year in the United States, at least a bare minimum of 36,000 Americans succumb to influenza and pneumonia every year. And that's for ever since we've been keeping records. So for the entire 20th century, it was, like I said, 36,000 people, and that's the bare minimum. And of course, the Spanish flu, that blew that out of the water. But I think it was over 1 million people who died from Spanish flu. But influenza and pneumonia have always been a very serious disease, and so COVID-19 is not an exception. It's just, it was a spin. We'll talk about politics then. The politics of COVID-19 was unbearable. Tuberculosis was number 2 in America for the second leading cause of death in the United States in 1910, and diarrhea. And of course, the reason I mention or bring this up is because I want my students to understand that the world you live in, the things you take for granted, your great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents basically had a world that was none like anything you can imagine, possibly. Because, in other words, why was diarrhea, like the 3rd leading cause of death in the United States in 1910? Well, it comes down to one thing. They didn't really die from diarrhea. They died from dehydration. Because if you don't have access to clean drinking water, you're going to basically succumb to the diarrhea. In other words, the dehydration. So I think it was just a few years later, like maybe 1914, 1915, something like that where they basically said, okay, we're going to make sure that every American citizen gets access to free, clean drinking water. Just like today, our government say everybody has access to the internet. So it's the same kind of concept that these certain basic rights, everybody needs to, have these basic rights. And of course, the access to clean drinking water was one of them. And of course, that's why if you look at 2012, diarrhea is not even on the list, right? It's not even in the top 5. Of course, another thing I bring up is in 1910, if you look at the United States and America and compare them in 1910, we're almost like twin states. I mean, if you include the St. Lawrence Seaway and the international sea lanes around the United States, America's bigger than China. If you discount those waterways, China's bigger. That just shows you just how close we are to being the same size. It's that close. However, that's not the only thing that makes us like sister countries. If you look at all the data points across the board, like how many Americans versus how many Chinese had, say, electricity in their homes, or had lights in their homes, or had a telephone in their homes, or had running water in their homes, or these things across the board, like those who graduated from a public education system in China in 1910 was around 6%. It was around 6%. So that, which we can say is about the same as in context, or the same. In other words, we want to compare apples to apples. So it was about 6% in China. It was only 8% in America. So 2% is probably putting it, right there in the margin of error. Sure, they got more people than we do, but still, that's probably within the margin of error. However, if you look at the dates between, say, 1910 and 1950, so 40 years later, China went from like 6% to 15%. America went from like 8% to like 45%. So America grew by like 30 something percent, and then of course China only grew by like doubled. So why did China fall so far behind? Well, if you look at the history, the Civil War in China actually started in 1927. Not, the Japanese invaded a decade later. So it wasn't maybe a hot war, a shooting war, but there was definitely an insurrection that started against the Republic in 1927. You can look at it in the books, in the history books. But so in other words, so if you look at between 1910 and 1940, China was at war for 22 years. America was at war 6. So China was at war, almost 4 times as long, or at least 3 times as long as we were. So we basically, we were buffered by 2 oceans during World War II. How many of our factories were bombed back into the Stone Age, or how many of our cities were razed? We're the only country in the world that actually survived or came out of World War II unscathed. So of course, at the end of the war, we Americans were like, okay, pay up. We helped you provide your armaments and your weapons and tanks and things like this. So you owe us. Hell, even the European Union, we basically helped set that thing into motion because of the Marshall Plan. If it wasn't for the Marshall Plan, maybe the Europeans would not have united under one banner, under the European Union. So we basically said, pay us back. So, well, they were like, okay, well, you're the only one who's actually making these goods or manufacturing these goods, because all our ball bearing plants were destroyed. And of course, you're making the things of quality that we want. So of course, sure, we'll use this as a means to pay you back. So of course, America came out on top. Of course, we won the Cold War. Of course, because the thing is, all our traditional trading partners back in for those however many decades during the Cold War were our traditional trading partners, right? So of course, I would say it's almost natural that America won the Cold War. But I digress. The 1910 comparison between China and America, I just use that as a way to basically show people that we are more similar than we are dissimilar. When we look at the textbook in my class about, basically it's Don Snow, and I forget the book title, but the thing is he likes to look at the differences in cultures. Oh, we're so different. We're so different. Like I said, I've worked around the world, and we're all the same. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, we're all the same. We all want the same thing. We want security. We want privacy. We want financial security. We want physical security. We want to make sure that our family are provided for. Our families are provided for. So we basically will, pursue these things that can guarantee financial and physical security. And of course, anyway, so that's 1910. Of course, has anyone ever read Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince? There's a section or story in the book called, we refer to as The Lieutenant. In that book, because Niccolo Machiavelli, what he basically, people say he wrote the book for different things. They say, oh, he was a Republican because he worked for Florence, and of course Florence was a republic. Yeah, and that's true. That is true. However, I say he wrote it as a how-to book, how to stay in power. If you're a prince, or as we could say in China, if you're a princeling, then this is how you stay in power. Because you gotta have to remember, Italy was pretty much like Afghanistan is today. Back then, in other words, they had a bunch of warlords. In other words, mafioso, because any monarch is basically just an over romanticized mafioso. I mean, they're the only two institutions where you basically have a transfer of power from parent to child. Those are the only two. People need to wake up to that concept that basically monarchs are nothing more than an over romanticized mafioso. So these warlords, I'm just going to call them warlords, these warlords who are vying for power in Republican Italy, like I said, are similar to the warlords that you see in Afghanistan today. They're basically regional, and it's basically a confederation. In other words, weak central government and powerful provincial governments. So in The Lieutenant, he says, well, if you have a policy that you know is going to be unpopular with the people, and you have this policy that could also be illegal, don't do it. Get some lieutenant to do it. In other words, have the lieutenant do these atrocities, like the Orca for Borgia. And this is what really happened. And that's why he includes it in The Prince. So when the people complain, Dorka he's killing people, he's razing villages, he's killing men, women, and children, he's committing atrocities. Well, have the Orca come to me, have him report to me. So of course when he reports to you, arrest this man. What? I was only doing your bidding, sire. And then he's like, put him to death. In other words, you're taking out two birds with one stone. In other words, you basically are, if say Diorca is someone who is competing for my dominance. In other words, he is becoming more popular with the people, and it seems as though that he could actually replace me. Well, why don't I just set him up? If I set him up, then I can, one, get rid of him, get rid of my competition, and two, now, my people, thank you, my people, I am here for you, I have saved you from this dastardly lieutenant of mine. So, like Tim Parks, who wrote the introduction for The Prince on this version that I read, he in the introduction he talks about, it was Penguin Books. He basically was vying for dominance in Romagna, and Ramiro de Orca was the lieutenant of Borgia, and Borgia basically did exactly what I just said. He basically set up his lieutenant. He told his lieutenant, do this. The people complain, so he killed him. So that way he looks like the savior. He basically made himself to look like the good guy, and he set up his lieutenant. In other words, they've been doing these games with us for centuries, if not millennia. People need to wake up. And so that's why I share the prince with you, because the lieutenant. If you want any kind of crime wave, or if you want some kind of lynchings, you want people based on skin color to be lynched, and basically showing people to be racist, you could set it up. In other words, just have a couple of have a lieutenant do a couple of lynchings. Then, of course, if he starts to talk, get rid of him, silence him. Then, of course, you don't have to worry about it getting out that you actually did it. And plus, it buys you job security, because now people are like, oh, we need to be protected. We need, the prince to save us, because he can help us get rid of these dastardly people who are so racist and vile and horrible and unjust. So it basically is job security for government. In other words, people will demand bigger government or more security because they basically fear or feel that maybe people are basically bad. So you're planting this idea that people are basically bad because you can orchestrate it. You can put on the show. All the world's a stage. So the thing is if you can basically orchestrate this, these actions or these inequalities or these racist or bigoted things, then of course do it, because you're basically, just like I said, divide and conquer. Just like they basically made us divide into vaccinated versus unvaccinated. Black and white, Muslim and Christian, different ways of dividing people. You need to be upset with your neighbor, not the government. Government's just here to help. We're here to help you. Robert Owen, I'll just read this to you. For example, British utopian socialist Robert Owen, financed by utilitarian Jeremy Bentham, gave speeches to the U.S. Congress on February 25th and March 7th, 1825, where he outlined his socialist beliefs and plans for a utopian community in New Harmony, Indiana, later in Yellow Springs, Ohio. His audience included U.S. Presidents John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison, in addition to outgoing U.S. President James Monroe and President-elect John Quincy Adams. In case you don't get it, that is the second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth presidents of the United States. My point to make to you today, or what I hope to convey to you today and show you today, is that the American founding fathers were utopians. They were utopians. However, their utopia is not our utopia. I'll show you why in a little bit, but the thing is, they were utopians and they were trying to set up their utopia in the United States. Universal Basic Income, UBI, was not endorsed by Sir Thomas More, as some of my students had the impression. But Sir Thomas More talked about minimum wage, which is basically like if you are already earning a salary, then at least you get a minimum, right? But UBI, on the other hand, is, it's universal. So everybody gets it. Everybody gets the Universal Basic Income. This was first mentioned or documented or maybe proposed by a gentleman by the name of Thomas Spence in 1775. Thomas Paine mentioned it in 1797. So Thomas Paine, those of you maybe who know the name, but Thomas Paine was probably the biggest instigator for the American Revolution in history. In other words, if it wasn't for Thomas Paine, it is very likely that we Americans would probably still be a colony of the British Empire. Why do I say that? Is because in his book or pamphlet, Common Sense, that he wrote in 1776 or published in 1776, he basically said at the end of the book, you're going to have to declare independence. If you do not declare independence and you want help from maybe the French or the Spanish, you're not going to get it. Why? Because they're not going to take you seriously. And one, that's an internal affair of the British. So if King George III is going to have to put down his insurrection, let him deal with that internal situation. Let him deal with it. However, by declaring independence, you basically are showing that no, we'll accept aid from the French, from the Spanish, from whoever is willing to give it. So he made a valid point in common sense, basically arguing for Declaration of Independence. And within like 6 months after he published, they did, in fact, declare independence. So let's talk about, I divert to elitism. Elitism is basically a rule by an elite. So what is an elite? A group or class of persons considered to be superior to others because of their intelligence, social standing, or wealth. That's what it says. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. I can understand, you being an elite because of your intelligence. I can even understand because of your social standing. But what qualifications or what certifications do you have just because you won the game of capitalism, just because you acquired more toys, just because you gained wealth or accrued wealth? What is your claim to fame? Or why are you considered wealth? What is it about people where they actually revere, not just respect, but revere people who just became wealthy? I don't understand it. I really don't. Because the thing is, I'm like, these people they don't deserve to be considered elite. I mean, why? Just because they have money? I mean, I'm sorry. It's just, to me, I'm like, a wealthy person is not an elite. But I digress. However, the etymology of the word elitism, it was entered the English language in 1953. My father was 13 years old in 1953. So I have issues with that. So in other words, it's a very recent development that we have the word elitism find its way into the English language. A nanny state is basically a government that makes decisions for people that they might otherwise make for themselves. Okay, so basically a patriarchy or matriarchy, like a monarchy, could be considered, a nanny state. In other words, the patriarch, the father, the matriarch, the mother of the nation, right? The king, the queen of the country. However, the problem with nanny states is they lead to excessive regulations. I mean, look at the United States, for example. Back in 2014, you had Gillen's page, I think it was, the study at Princeton, where they talk about how we're no longer a democracy but a oligarchy. I mean, that seems to be true. I mean, if you look, I will just remind you that Milton Friedman, probably the greatest American economist of the 20th century, basically said, government spending is a tax. Government spending is a tax. So if you have a government that arbitrarily just spends money, then, of course, look at our government. Our government in America basically it spends more in a month than most countries spend in a year for their defense. We're spending like $12 billion a month in, say, Iran. Back in I think it was 2010. 2010, the United States spent more than 50% of all expenditures for defense in the world. What that What that means is that America spent more than the rest of the world combined Today, we only say, oh, well, we're outpacing the next 16. But back in like 2010, we outspent everybody on the planet. I mean, it's unbelievable. I mean, we're talking about 650 billion dollars in 1 year we spend on our defense in the United States. I'll also make another point. If, as an American, your government has the capability to actually give away money, like the $200 billion that we gave to Ukraine over time, in humanitarian aid, that we said. But if your country that you live in, that you call home, has enough money to give to another country, you're paying too much in taxes. You're paying too much in taxes if they have enough money to just give it away. So I'll just say that, it's all about racketeering. It's all about, transfer of wealth, greasing palms, things like this. It's about corruption. So we're not going to do anything to stop it unless we actually get a new government in there. And that's one reason I'm making these videos. So my question is, why was Socrates made to drink hemlock poison, in 399 BC? Well, he was espousing a ideology. Remember, he lived in the Athenian Republic, but he was espousing a ideology where they basically made him drink hemlock. Well, I should also mention that this was in 399 BC, so technically, I guess it was the Spartans who made him drink hemlock. The Spartans had already won the First Peloponnesian War, so they were the ones who technically made him drink the hemlock. But why? Well, I say, if you find in all this literature, you can find different reasons why they say he did it, but I think it could be because the Spartans and the Athenians felt that he tricked them into going to war. Because remember, the Spartans originally didn't want to attack Athens, but I think the last time I said Thessalonians, but I think it was the Thebians who basically convinced Sparta to go to war with Athens. Anyway, the book 6 of the Republic, you have a story about written by Plato about Socrates and Adeimantus. Adeimantus is advocating for democracy. He's advocating for equality, more egalitarian, or more of an equal and fair. Well, we'll just say equal society. Well, Socrates, I don't know if you were aware of this, but he really was not a fan of democracy. We say that Greek gave us the modern Greek, or the modern democracy, the modern concept of democracy, and that's probably true. However, the story goes something like this. The story about the boat that I'm going to tell you is essentially like 10 pages long. I'm going to have to give you the short version, okay? But essentially, like I said, Adeimantus was advocating for democracy. Socrates, on the other hand, was like, no, Adeimantus. He said, look at it this way. He said, you're on a boat. You're in rough seas. The captain gets washed overboard. You no longer have a captain. Would you want to just get anyone to captain that ship? Or would you rather have someone who's been educated and taught in seafaring and navigation? And of course, Adeimantus is like, well, of course, the latter. He said, then why would it be any different for your country, for your government? He said, we, the learned, we philosophers need to help guide people to understand what they need most. We can actually help maybe corral them or nurture them in a direction where they can understand. Because, we, the experts, the specialist, we can understand that, these complex matters. The average man doesn't have time to concern himself with these things. He's got his own job. So, in other words, he's basically saying the same thing that we modern capitalists say is trust the experts, trust the specialists. In other words, elitism, right? He's basically advocating for elitism. So, my question then is, why did it take 2,352 years to be introduced to English? If he's espousing elitism in, like 420 BC, and he was made to drink hemlock in 399 BC, why did it take English speakers over 2,000 years, almost 2,400 years, to learn of this philosophy of let's the elites do it, the nanny state, the monarchist, whoever's going to do it for you. I don't buy it. Hopefully you don't either. The Napoleonic Wars started in 1803 and ended in around 1815. I'm going to talk to you about Emil Mayer Rothschild. Emil Mayer Rothschild lived in Frankfurt. He had 5 sons. His eldest son, he stayed in Frankfurt. His second son went to Vienna. His third son went to London. His fourth son went to Naples, and his fifth son went to Paris. Well, 30 years ago, maybe 35, I actually used to work for Morgan Stanley. So as a person who used to be into money, I watch gold. I just watch gold. And so did anybody notice January 2025? Did anybody notice that they moved tons, and I mean tons, of gold from London to New York City? Did you notice that? Why? Well, there's a technique to maximize your profits in the gold market called arbitrage. Arbitrage basically is just, if I can demand a higher price in New York and my gold is in London, I'll just ship my gold in by tons. I'm talking about pallet loads. Basically, they shipped tons of gold to New York City, and of course, they sold it there. So they could maximize the return on their gold, or in other words, they can maximize the profits. So this arbitrage is one reason that Rothschild had all his children, or all those sons, living in various capitals around Europe, is because he could take advantage of arbitrage. I don't know if he was the first, but of course they were doing this before the Napoleonic Wars. The true brilliance of Rothschild was the fact that his messenger was at Waterloo. And of course he was watching as Napoleon lost at Waterloo. And of course, as you all know, Waterloo was the final battle. So if Napoleon won, he probably could have declared himself as emperor of the reunited or the new Ottoman Empire, or the new Roman Empire, the new, Holy Roman Empire. In other words, if he won, he could basically call himself the emperor of the new world, basically, or of united Europe, because that's what he was basically doing, was he's reuniting, I guess you could say, the whole Roman Empire, and uniting all of Europe. But then the flip side of that is if he lost, then of course we got rid of Napoleon. So good riddance, that kind of thing. Well, of course, when the messenger for Rothschild, he left, he went back to Lord Rothschild and said, "Sir Rothschild, we have seized the day, carpe diem, and we are victorious." And of course, what did Rothschild do? He started selling all those assets. Maybe the mercantile exchange and the stock exchange back then was not as sophisticated as it is today, but he still had sway. In other words, people, like I said, I work for Morgan Stanley. I can tell you that people buy on hype. People buy on hype. And so they see somebody else buy it. Maybe Elon Musk bought this or somebody, bought that. So, I'll buy some too. So they buy on hype. They see somebody else make a move, they'll follow like lemmings or like sheep. And so Rothschild started selling all the gold. And so, of course, that alarmed the King of England because he's like, well, wait a minute, that means we've lost. So of course, he was pleasantly surprised when his messenger came the next day and notified him that, Her Majesty, we are victorious. And so he learned that England had won in Waterloo from his own messenger. And he's like, what? Maybe that's when he realized that, Rothschild is basically playing us. But it was too late. So basically, the gold prices had gone down, like 20% of what it was prior to that morning. In other words, it reached like the cellar. And so he bought back all the gold at like bargain basement prices, and that's how he cornered the gold market in 1814, I think it was. Or I guess 1815. But he's not the only Jewish family that did this. There are like 5 families that did this. We'll talk more about them in a little bit, though. But that's the true brilliance of Rothschild, is he basically that one day he pretty much garnered or cornered the gold market in Europe, and pretty much you could say in the world. October 1917 is the Red Revolution, or the Russian Revolution. In 1917, it is said that the Russian Empire had only about 125 million people. That includes 5 million Jews in 1917. Keep that in mind. Russia only had 5 million Jews out of 125 million people, so that's only like 4%. 4% of the Russian Empire was Jewish. Lionel de Rothschild became a baronet. In other words, Queen Victoria gave him title in 1847, so he became baronet. The rise of the modern nation state, in other words, you had the Spring of Revolution, I think it's called, and that's the spring of 1848, the very next year. You had 17 revolutions throughout Europe. And keep in mind, this is before the internet. So if you basically are going to organize 17 revolutions throughout Europe in one season, it's going to be orchestrated. It's going to be highly organized, because how do you get? In other words, there's 17 monarchies in Europe, so that's not like all of them. All of the monarchies in Europe basically were vying for, or trying to fight for survival almost. So, but these revolutions, like I said, were throughout the spring of 1848. The same year that the Communist Manifesto was published by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Anti-Semitism entered the English language in 1881. Came to us from the German. Pogrom came into the English language in 1882. Came to English from the Russian. Within a few years, you had basically in 1885, Queen Victoria relented and basically named Mayer Rothschild, or Nathaniel Mayer Rothschild, a full baron. Well, the reason I share this with you is because when I think it was Sir William Gladstone tried to convince Queen Victoria to make Rothschild appear. Because remember, the Rothschilds were very helpful during the Napoleonic Wars. And so William Gladstone was like, "Lady, we should make Rothschild appear." And so she almost laughed in his face, as the story goes. She was like, but Lord Gladstone, he's a speculator in gold. So she basically mocked the idea. She's almost like I said, she almost practically laughed in his face, basically saying, he's just a speculator in gold. He's not a peer to the Queen of England. And so the theory goes, or my theory goes, is that 1848 was the Jewish mafia, or the Jewish mob, basically showing we can flex our muscles. We can show you just how much influence we have in the world. And so we can basically orchestrate revolutions across Europe. So unless you make us peer, we're going to burn the house down. And that's the theory. So then, of course, within a few years, they started showing Queen Victoria how they could help her consolidate power. And so basically, after he was made peer, Zionism just so happened to explode. And Zionism is a political movement. It's not a religious movement. In fact, if you wanted to become Jewish or if you just wanted to convert to Judaism, for one, what ethnicities actually allow converts? There are none. In other words, Judaism is not a race. It's an ideology. It's a pseudoscience. It's a religion. So if you want to convert to Judaism, if you want to become Jewish, then the Jewish Encyclopedia is printed by Funk and Wagnall, and it is basically in every library in pretty much every synagogue I've ever been in. But in the 1906 edition, it says, in 1852, Hollingsworth, an Englishman, urged the establishment of a Jewish state because the necessity of safeguarding the overland route to India. And that's what the Jewish Encyclopedia says in the 1906 edition. So in other words, it was an Englishman who first proposed Israel. And they just wanted basically an overland route to India. Zionism adopted the Star of David as the symbol in 1897, and that's largely because Rothschild liked that symbol. Here's the timeline. These family names that I have here on this slide are, of course, Rothschild's, Bischofsheims, Pierres, Seligmans, and the Lazards. These are the 5 Jewish families I was talking about who cornered. Well, they saw what the Rothschilds had done with basically accruing great wealth by playing arbitrage, or basically cornering the gold market. So they did the same thing. So these other Jewish families basically also participated and helped basically maybe even substantiate, or probably even help found what we might know as the Chabad, or which is maybe the Jewish mob, the Jewish mafia. So they basically hide behind not, wine or gambling or things we usually think of the Sicilians or the Italians or these other mobsters to hide behind. They hide behind religion, ideology. So that's why they're seen as pious and very, very, honorable and very truthful, with honor, integrity. But anyway, so Lifeway Christian Resources was established in 1891. I went to to a Southern Baptist Convention, SBC, church as I grew up in America. The SBC, the Southern Baptist, is the largest Protestant denomination in the United States. The only Christian denomination bigger than the SBC are the Catholics. So the largest Protestant denomination in the United States is the SBC. However, the SBC, in my church that I grew up in, we considered ourselves to be the most democratically elected or democratically run church in America, or probably even in the world, because in the SBC, they resolve everything by resolution. They vote on everything. So there is no board or committee or anything like that. It's basically, like I said, everything's voted for in referendum in the Southern Baptist Convention. But anyway, so maybe that's why I felt I had the freedom to escape, Christianity, and that's why I became agnostic when I'm 24. But Lifeway Christian Resource, I remember this picture. It was basically a picture of slaves building, or at least these people building the pyramids, and with these sleds and these great ropes and chains of people, miles long, it seemed like, pulling these great blocks of stone and putting them into place and stuff like this. So, but I remember in the literature, it is a in-house publication. Lifeway Christian Resources is a way to study the Bible, and it is printed by the church. However, those things they said about the Jews being slaves of the Egyptians for 400 years, and it was the Christians. It was the Jews who actually built the pyramids while they were slaves to the pharaohs. That it's all lies, 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 lies. It's all of it. For one thing, we know today, because we found the settlements on the Giza Plateau, we know that these people weren't even slaves. And so how is it, or why is a church distributing propaganda? Why is it distributing propaganda? So that's my question: is why is a church spreading propaganda? Who financed the Lifeway Christian Resources? Just as a reminder, I'm not saying this. Winston Churchill said it. So Winston Churchill, and there's the website on the slide, but according to Winston Churchill, in I think February of 1920, he wrote this article called "Zionism versus Bolshevism." He says that the October Revolution in Russia was not a Russian revolution, but a Jewish invasion. Not my words, his words. He said this. So what he said was, he in the article he talked about like the prominent Jews of the day, like Rosa Luxemburg in Germany and Emma Goldman of the United States. But he goes on to talk about how, and now at last, this band of extraordinary personalities from the underworld of the great cities of Europe and America have gripped the Russian people by the hair of their heads and have become practically the undisputed masters of that enormous empire. He's saying that the Jews invaded. Is that why maybe Stalin had the purges? Well, according to a book that I can't think of who the author is at the moment, but he said of the original 61 Soviet commissars, 41 were Jewish. But I can show you a video where Vladimir Putin in 2013, in June 12th, 2013, he was officially opening the Schneerson collection in Moscow's Jewish Museum and Tolerance Center, and where he basically says that of the original Soviet government, 80 to 85% was Jewish.
Так бы, наверное, поступила любая библиотека, любой музей.
Конечно, конечно.
Решение о национализации этой библиотеки было принято советским правительством, первым советским правительством, и членами его являлись примерно на 80-85% евреи. Но они же, руководствуясь ложными идеологическими соображениями, шли тогда на аресты и репрессии и иудеев, и православных, и представителей других конфессий, мусульман. Они всех гребли под одну гребенку. И вот эти идеологические шоры и ложные идеологические установки, они, слава Богу, рухнули. И мы действительно сегодня по сути передаем еврейской общине эти книги с улыбкой.
Путин несколько месяцев назад и предложил перенести библиотеку в еврейский центр. Она будет оцифрована, и доступ к книгам получится.
In other words, he seems to be substantiating exactly what Winston Churchill said, almost a century before. If you go to the website that's listed on this slide, you'll see that it's, the Kremlin. And of course, you'll find this. It's going to be in Russian, but down below is the translation. And so it is basically, like I said, that's what he said. The original Soviet government, the first Soviet government in 1921 was 80 to 85% Jewish. How does 4% go from being such a small minority to dominant in the first Soviet government? In other words, it seems to substantiate exactly what Winston Churchill alluded to or said in 1920. feudal society, the monarchs basically ruled the day. Our ancestors put up with a lot of crap, and I'm not just talking about in Europe, but around Asia and pretty much every feudal society, marriages were arranged. You couldn't even, you couldn't even marry for love. You didn't marry because you wanted to. You married basically because you had to. You married whoever your mother or father, told you to marry. You didn't have selection and basically of like who to marry. The Braveheart love story is basically just that, mostly fiction. But I mean, sure, there are probably exceptions to every rule. But the thing is, for most part, marriages were arranged in feudal societies. Serfs were considered property. So if you went into debt and I'm the land owner, you're going to work my land until I tell you can leave. And then if you run off and escape, I'm going to have to pay somebody to track you down. I'm probably going to add time to your time you're going to have to stay. Oh, no, I had to pay those guys to hunt you down, so now I'm going to add a year to your time that you owe to me. Your debt is now increased because you're going to have to pay for those horsemen, not me, not those those bounty hunters or whatever we'll call them, or bondsmen. The conscription or draft was common, so if the king rode up, or one of the king's men rode up on their horse and said, "Yeah, you're going to fight for the king," and you started to say no, an arrow through the heart. They dropped you before you finish your sentence. Dropped you like a sack of potatoes because you didn't say no to the king. You didn't say no to the emperor. That our ancestors had it horrible. Our ancestors had no freedoms to speak of. The things that we take for granted, our ancestors really didn't have these luxuries that we do today. I mean, so when the American country was established in 1776 and they declared that they have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, these were pretty profound ideas. Because most people around Europe were like, I don't know if I have that right. Right? I mean, in other words, they probably didn't even acknowledge it because they're like, oh no, I'll just pay off my debt. I'll work for the man. I'll go work his land. But let me remind you that the Magna Carta came in 1215. It's an agreement between the king and nobility. Actually, not the people, but between the nobility. King John was arbitrarily making up laws. Why? Well, just like in Machiavelli was like, well, just get a lieutenant to do it. So if you have a noble, maybe the Duke of York, who's becoming too popular and you think he's going to challenge your authority, set him up. I accuse Sir William of murder. What? Arrest this man. Take him to the Tower. Take him to the Tower of England. So this is one way to basically deal with, challenges to your authority. Is basically just arrest them, make them, basically undermine their authority. Well, that's where the Magna Carta comes from. They insisted on habeas corpus. Habeas corpus, you better have a corpse. In other words, if you're going to accuse me of murder, you better produce a corpse. I have a right to face my accuser. I have a right to, let me see the evidence before me. So if you're accusing me of crime, produce a dead body. You best, in other words, I have a right to justice. I have a right to even, I think Magna Carta is also where we got jury trial. So all these things, the nobility would say, no. I want these things because I don't want you, the King of England, King John, arbitrarily making up all these silly things and then accusing me of a crime, then killing Fuddy-Duddy or killing whoever. If you're accusing me of murder, produce a dead body. Let me see, because like I said, he was. Accusing people of things without even evidence. So the Magna Carta, you can see, is basically, it's almost like a Bill of Rights. Like, we want habeas corpus, we want jury trial, we want this, and this. So it's basically like a shopping list. This is what we want. This is what we demand. but it can also be seen as, maybe a contract. So it is a contract between, an agreement between the king and nobility. So these are Englishmen. So the people who set up North America, or set up America as a country, they were aware of the Magna Carta. As you know, the United Nations, in their charter, they talk about to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights is actually included in their charter. So you can't even define human rights without rights of the individual. All humans, the individual. So where did this right of the individual come from? It comes to us from natural law. Of course, if you look up natural law, it seems Wikipedia is actually trying to marginalize it, because they basically talk about natural law being this or that, or maybe it's the academics who basically trying to say natural law meant certain things, and I'm like, you're not really catching the whole concept of what John Locke was saying. There's a lot of what Wikipedia seems to imply is that natural law implies like God's law. In other words, that you can't be secular and believe in God in natural law. Natural law is basically the almost like intellectual design. So intellectual design is basically as what people who are maybe religious, they say, well, that proves that there is a sentient or sentience out there that basically designed and created the universe. So this intelligent design argument has been used for decades, and it's making a comeback. But back in the 60s, they promptly disputed and basically disproved it. But like I said, there's people who still adhere to this concept that, oh no, natural law is all about spirituality and religion. No, it's not. No, it's not. John Locke, what John Locke actually said was that all men being naturally free and equal and independent, no one can be deprived of this freedom, etc., and subjected to the political power of someone else without his own consent. In other words, you and I have to acquiesce. We have to surrender. We have authority, like we talked about before. Morality comes from within, so I have the capability to judge what is right and wrong for myself through my morality. It's only through norms that I rely on somebody else. So the only way anyone can strip off his natural liberty and clothe himself in the bonds of civil liberty is for him to agree with other men to unite into a community so as to live together comfortably, safely, and peaceably. In other words, he's saying, if I, as Thomas Paine talks about in Common Sense, the first few paragraphs of Common Sense, he basically lays out something called social evolutionism. In social evolutionism, he basically said this like 8 decades before Darwin in biological evolutionism. So he came almost a century before biological evolutionism. But he came up with this idea that governments evolve. In other words, if I'm a mountain man up high up on my mountain, I don't care about anybody else. John Locke was talking about a natural state. He keeps talking about the natural state in the treatises of government. And so in the treatises of government, he basically talks about this natural state where, we will prefer to do whatever I want. In other words, think about it. If I'm up on the mountain and I'm fighting a bear, I don't care what you think. I'm going to kill that bear because it's either him or me. I dare say you probably be the same way. If there's nobody else is watching, then you're probably going to kill that bear too. So no care. It doesn't matter about people talking about, oh, don't be humane to the animals. Screw you. I'm going to survive. So I'm going to go after that bear and basically make sure I live, and maybe that bear will succumb to me rather than me succumb to it. But when I was in the military, I had a friend, John from Texas, who basically when we came out of the woods playing Army, we had a lay down inspection. So we had to make sure that we had all of our gear and everything intact. So what John did was he bought a second set of everything. He had 2 entrenching tools. He had he had 2 of everything. A pair of boots, second pair of even uniforms. He had pretty much a second set of everything. And I'm like, John, why'd you do that? I said, he said, well, I'd rather spend the money, he said. And it's not about saving time either. It's just that I hate being told what to do. I'm like, what? He said, I know they're going to ask us to do the lay down inspection after we come back out of the field. And basically they're going to ask us to make sure it's within, it's presentable. And it's within, so we can do an inspection, a lay down inspection. So what I'll do is I'll just go ahead. I have this new stuff that's in the trunk of my car. I'll just go get it. I'll lay it down. That's way I don't have to spend all day cleaning my boots, cleaning my entrenching tool, cleaning all this equipment, because it's new. It looks new. And so I just hate being told what to do. I'd rather take the initiative and do it prior and preempt their command, their order to tell me to do it. That way they don't have to, they're not telling me to do it. So, and I was like, that actually makes sense. In other words, the reason I share this anecdote with you is because John taught me a very valuable lesson. There are some people, even worse than me. I hate being told what to do. But some people, even like my friend John, was like, you're not telling me what to do. It just got under his skin, right? He really abhorred being told what to do. So we, as naturally free people, we basically, that's our natural state. Our natural state is like the mountain man on top of the mountain. We're basically, we savor that ability to endure on our own, and we maybe accept the challenges of living alone because of these, because we can't depend on anybody but ourselves anyway. So that's what he's talking about. He's talking about the natural state as being as just free. So then, of course, when he talked about, we were about the only way anyone can strip off his natural liberty and clothe himself in the bonds of civil society. What he's talking about is if you come down off that mountain and come into society, then you're going to basically have to give up some of that freedom, because you're going to have to be concerned about, well, what do these other people think? So I can't just swing my fist willy-nilly. If I infringe on somebody else's rights, if in this pursuit of my happiness, I step on your toes, then I need to be able to live in a manner that where I'm like, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to step on your toe, and acknowledge it, and show some respect to my other individuals who are in this society. So this whole concept of John Locke's natural state is just, well, we're naturally embrace freedom, like a bird, savors, time outside the cage. It'd much rather be outside the cage than in it, right? So that's what I think he's saying, and I think I think Thomas Paine says the same thing in Common Sense. You'll see why. Just a minute. Well, anyway, in 1762 we had social contract. That was just like a decade before the Declaration of Independence. But of course it comes to us from probably the Magna Carta, because the Magna Carta could be viewed or interpreted as a contract. So the contract theory, the Magna Carta could be seen as basically maybe the inspiration for even Rousseau's social contract theory. The political philosophers like Thomas Hobbes came up with the idea that maybe true legitimate power has to be representative, right? That's where maybe John Locke got it from, because Hobbes came before him by a couple of decades. So this, because he mentions it too, that all legitimate government must be representative. In other words, this concept that Hobbes and Locke talked about. Thomas Paine, the biggest instigator for the American Revolution, also talks about it in Common Sense. Well, why? Here's a picture of the British colonies, the 13 colonies, just basically the east coast of North America in 1772. I want to talk about Thomas Paine in more detail, but unfortunately we'll need to wait until maybe not next time. Because I've gone out of order, I need to go ahead and present to you a closer look at science and pseudoscience, so that way you understand. Well, one reason I went into the difference in comparing and contrasting China with America is because, teaching intercultural communication, right? So why are we different? So if I'm comparing, say, A and B, and say A is a person from, say, China, and B is a person from maybe Canada. So, and I watch this observation between A and B. I can see that they have this miscommunication, this misunderstanding, and so I can separate these issues that they are having either into personal issues. In other words, the traits and characteristics are dependent upon that specific person, because that person seems to have maybe certain expectations or ideas or beliefs that make them predisposed to certain belief systems, or where they basically have these certain expectations on how people act. If I was someone who came from a specific region or specific background, then of course my norms, my conditioning is going to be different. So, or is it cultural? So the cultural issues could be, well, these conditionings. So if I say come from one of these, say, regions where the expectations are conditioned differently. In other words, the only reason I have or can label anything a cultural issue is because, one, I've either conditioned myself or been conditioned to see it that way or expect certain things about the people around me. I've seen, say, 2 out of 3. I've seen 3 out of 4, or maybe 4 out of 5 of my friends, colleagues, or family do it this way. So I have a conditioning. I have expectations that, well, my friends seem to do it that way. It must be the norm. That's anecdotal. So I've either been conditioned, I've been encouraged because maybe my family or my friends or my colleagues have all encouraged me, hey, when you do this, before you cross the street, why don't you check both ways? Look both ways before you cross the street. So these things have been encouraged the way for me to behave, or I have just been taught, right? So if the belief or the we'll just say the belief or tradition is more ingrained or substantial, or maybe even that convention is law or a dictate of society, then of course, like, how do you operate a motor vehicle in your country? Well, not every country has the same road signs. Not every country has the same laws. Some people even drive on the opposite side of the street. So you better look at the written word. In other words, look at the book that basically regulates the way they use or operate motor vehicles in that country. If you do not, you could end up killing yourself or someone else, or at least seriously injuring that person. So, or a person. So it's basically just comes down to, well, you've been officially taught to see it this way. You've been encouraged to see it this way, or you've been, conditioned to see it this way. That is a cultural issue. That's the only reason we have intercultural communication as a course, and it's also the only reason that when you go to these places, you have to say, well, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. Because you don't know what's normal for these people. You don't know the norm. What you were taught in, say, Minnesota might be different than what's in South Carolina, or what's in Washington D.C. might be different than what you see in, say, Ohio. So it's not that unique. It's not that substantial of a difference. I mean, in other words, most of the differences that you see that are attributed to cultural phenomenon is conditioned, encouraged, or taught. That's why I went into the background between China and America. I need you to acknowledge that the only reason you see, say, Chinese that much different, a overgeneralization is a stereotype. If you are overgeneralizing and you believe in racism, you are probably following for a stereotype. All right, so a lot of people, when they talk about utopia, they always refer to Thomas More's Utopia. However, this is where I'm going to show you that their utopia and our utopia is not the same thing. Like I said, it's my allegation, or it's my assertion that our founding fathers were trying to set up a utopia in America. Well, remember, these were not wild-eyed parrots, as Paul Harvey would say. These men were men of means. These men were men of great wealth and stature. These men were educated men. These men probably could speak Latin, Greek, and French. And, in other words, these men were very educated, very, very well read. So they knew the Magna Carta. They knew Thomas More's Utopia. So let's look see what Utopia actually says. In Thomas More's Utopia, slavery is okay. To own slaves. In other words, in Thomas More's Utopia, you essentially have two classes of people. You have citizens who can enjoy the luxuries and the benefits of living under a utopian dream. But then another class of citizen, or another class of people, not even citizens, who are basically labor, slavery, slaves. So these people, he basically said, slavery's okay. What did he say about the slaves? In his Utopia, he says they should be disarmed, and they should having money is sufficient of conviction. In other words, he was basically saying that even possessing money or possessing weapons, you could murder, you could kill them justly, because, in other words, to kill a slave for possessing weapons or money, it is a death penalty. And so, but then he goes on to say that, so they cannot hope to escape, for their habit being all part of it different from what is commonly worn. Commonly worn? Habits we do, right? He's talking about like the nun's habit. The nun's habit is essentially, a uniform. In other words, in Thomas More's Utopia, slaves will have to wear a uniform. But then he continues, they cannot fly away or, escape unless they would go naked, take off their uniform. And even then, their cropped ear would betray them. In other words, in Thomas More's Utopia, he's talking about cropping people's ear. In other words, in Germany and in America, we crop like schnauzers and Doberman pinschers and pincer ears. In other words, in Thomas More's Utopia, you're no better than a dog. You are subhuman. So in other words, you're going to be identified by a cropped ear and a uniform. And you're not going to be able to have many liberties, because he continues on this page 54 in Utopia, he says, you cannot meet together or talk or speak with one another. In other words, you don't want your slaves talking and planning and plotting escape, so that way you kind of keep them segregated. Don't let them speak. Don't let them assemble. For those of you who are not American, and those of you who are, and you wonder why American founding fathers insisted on a Bill of Rights. Well, I don't want to be torn from my bed, cropped my ear, and then sold into slavery over my dead body. And I'd be willing to bet they were the same way. They're like, that's not going to happen to me. Because that's why they insisted on a right to bear arms and right to keep arms. This is also why they said we have a right to freedom of speech, freedom of press, right to assemble, because these are the things that were denied in Thomas More's Utopia. They knew Thomas More's Utopia. However, what if, rather than cropping somebody's ear, what if we just segregate people based on skin color? Wouldn't that be easier? Because if I have to crop somebody's ear, that's actually malice or malicious, right? I mean, that's assault. I'm having to assault you to basically identify you, like branding a cow. You know, I'm having to assault you to identify you as a slave. But if I could make my slave someone, maybe just a different skin color, isn't that a lot easier? So my suggestion is, the reason we have racism is they needed us to be racist. They've tried for over 100 years to make us racist. They basically have said you need two classes of people to make More's Utopia work. And so the thing is, you have slaves and you have your free, people who will live in their utopia. But without that utopia or that slave class, how can you enjoy it? Because you're going to have to work and make labor and make products and provide services and things like this. There's going to be some labor force. They needed us to be racist, people. They needed us to be racist. But I can tell you, most of us can't hold on to hatred. It's the vitriol, it's toxic. Have you ever tried to, sure, we might hate their politics or hate what they said, don't like their words, maybe strongly dislike them. But the thing is to say we actually hate them, most of us, unless alcohol's talking, most of us are like, forgive and forget. Most of us are like, that's too toxic. I can't hate somebody for the rest of my life. You're going to basically give yourself stomach ulcers. So most of us are like, I'll forget about it. So this whole idea of racism is because they needed to make us racist to build their utopia. Racism's not even real. Next episode, I do want to take, like I said, a closer look at pseudoscience and science. The week after that, because I've gone out of order, I do need to take a closer look at Thomas Paine. Not only because Thomas Paine is acknowledged as probably one of the greatest political philosophers of all time in all human history of what we know. But why don't we talk about his economic contributions? He technically was an economist as well. He has economic theories. Look at agrarian justice. If you read Agrarian Justice, you'll know just how much of an economist. Sure, some of his ideas were silly, but I'm not here to. The reason I want you to see it is because I want you to understand the evolution of America. I want you to understand why they're hiding this from you. I want you to understand how our founding fathers basically built this country and why. And it's so, I would say it is in a way beautiful. They tried. But the thing is, there is corruption. It was manipulated. They have been manipulated. And the manipulation of culture is propaganda. If you're not willing to go down the rabbit holes, you're not willing to actually do the due diligence and actually try to ascertain what is truth, and you're just willing to accept the anecdotal, you get what you deserve. Anyway, long live the Republic.